Now then, in today's episode, I have a chat with Dr Natalie Roberts. Natalie is the Executive Director of MSF UK, aka Médecins Sans Frontières, aka Doctors Without Borders. We talk about Natalie's journey from medical doctor in the NHS here in the UK to leading a humanitarian medical organisation that is in many countries in humanitarian crises and disasters and conflict zones all around the world. We talk about what the pull is, what the draw is to working in conflict zones. We talk about what good leadership is. We also talk about how to have difficult conversations and explore whether Natalie's time as a medical doctor has helped her develop that skill. And we talk about what being bold as an organisation genuinely means. Loads of organisations talk about being bold, but how many of them genuinely are? I would argue that MSF are one of the ones that are, so we get into that and Natalie's thinking around how to maintain that. We also talk about when to speak out on critical issues. We talk about a moment in December, which is 6 or 7 weeks ago now, when MSF released a report that concluded genocide was taking place in Gaza. We talk about Natalie's thinking on that report. We talk about the considerations that Natalie and the organisation had to go through. We also touch on managing stress in high pressure environments and why being authentic at work is critical. So grab a brew. I have a salted caramel weird German tea, but it's very delicious. Hope you enjoy the conversation. See you in a bit.
I'm a medical doctor, just medical doctor. I used to work in the UK. I'm from North Wales. So I'm a big fan of my local football team, Wrexham Football Club, who are now famous.
They are.
And somehow through a process that was completely unplanned, I am now the executive director of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders in the UK.
So tell me about the unplanned process. How have you gone from Wrexham to executive director of MSF UK?
Well, it was entirely unplanned. Essentially, I decided when I was quite young I wanted to be a doctor. That was the start. So that was one step into working for Médecins Sans Frontières MSF, because we're a medical organisation. And I guess at some point, even when I was young, I thought I wanted to work for MSF because I had this idea of going overseas and having an adventure and, helping people in different places. But really, I had a very unrealistic vision of what that actually looked like. It was just something in my mind. Then I forgot all about it for a very long period of time and worked as a doctor in the UK, went to medical school, and then decided again that I wanted to go and work for MSF and to go overseas and to see what happened, essentially. So that's what I did. I worked in the National Health Service for 8-9 years. Initially trained as a surgeon, then moved to emergency medicine. And there's something in there where I thought I'd go off and give this a go. Not for very long. It was always planned for maybe 6 months. And then I would come back and go to my real job in the UK. But then I joined MSF and started working for the organisation. And I moved around a lot of places. I did a lot of the international side of things, a lot of emergency response work. And then each time when I'd finish one project or, one placement, I'd be asked if I wanted to go on the next one. So I said yes. And during that time, my role changed. I mean, it was never really a sort of hands-on medical doctor with MSF because that's not how our organization works necessarily. I don't normally speak the local language, and so I'm not the best person to be treating patients. But my job evolved over some years, from being, the manager of a group to being the coordinator of the entire country program, and eventually moving into sort of operational management in the headquarters. So in Paris for me, I spent some years there as head of emergencies for MSF, the Paris operational center, we call it, of MSF. And then over time, each time people just kept offering me new roles. Do you want to do this job? And I'd say, well, sounds interesting. I'll give it a go. So it took us sort of step further and further away from our direct operational work from the emergency head of emergencies into what's called a reflection unit. So started thinking really about what MSF does and where we work and what we do. And then at some point, this job in the UK came up and said, well, how about running MSF in the UK? And I just said, okay, well, I'll give it a go. Apply for the job. And I think having that approach of, well, it sounds interesting, let's see how it works. If I don't get the role, it doesn't really matter. I'm happy where I am. But if I do get the role, then it'll be an exciting challenge and it'll be something different for me. And so that's what I applied for the job. They gave me the job, and I've been here now for the last just over 2 years.
Amazing. For people who MSF is very well-known organisation, but for people who may be hearing these initials for the first time, can you just give us a brief overview as to MSF, what you focused on, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders, we're an international medical humanitarian organisation. So we're only actually 53 years old now, so it's relatively young in comparison to some, but as you say, really quite well known these days. So essentially, we start some basic fundamentals around medical ethics, and then being independent, impartial, neutral, so the humanitarian kind of principles. But really, the point of MSF is that you associate to act. So it's a group of people who joined MSF because they want to take medical humanitarian action somewhere in the world, and has grown over the last 53 years from being a sort of small French organization to being really a global organization. We have over 50,000 staff, more actually, working around the world. More than 90% of them are what we call locally recruited staff. So they live and work where they're from, and they work for us in those locations. And then some staff being internationally mobile staff. So the people who move away from where they're from to go and work elsewhere to help people there. So I started with MSF as internationally mobile staff, and I guess now I'm now locally recruited. I'm living and working where I'm from. So. And we work now as an organisation in more than 70 countries around the world, really in places of humanitarian crisis. So, and because we're medical, we need to bring a sort of medical benefit. That doesn't mean necessarily practicing medicine everywhere, but really taking that medical approach to the crises where we work. So often that will be conflict zones. So currently, you have the major conflicts in Gaza, where hopefully, the ceasefire will hold, but we also have Sudan, Myanmar, the Democratic Republic of Congo, countries where either in acute or chronic conflict zones, but also other types of humanitarian crises, that be population displacement or natural disasters or outbreaks, epidemics. And we kind of come in with our medical humanitarian approach and try and really work in a way we call person-centered, which is kind of coming in, and because we're independently funded, we're a private organisation, it allows us the flexibility to really decide what we do and where we work.
Are you able to sort of say, how do you identify where you work? Like, what's the sort of criteria that you run through?
I mean, what's very interesting is because of our independence and our flexibility, we don't have any set criteria. And I think even in the notion of what is a crisis and what is an emergency is very fluid. And I think that's one of the benefits of what we do. I mean, we want to help people in crisis. So, but I think there can be a false dichotomy between the idea of humanitarian response and development work. Some of the places we work have been in crisis for a very long time, and some of the people we assist have, their crisis is not acute. We did a huge amount of work in HIV, and HIV now is a disease that people live with, not a disease that people die from, but only because we're intervening and we're there. So there's no fixed criteria necessarily. A lot of it is really around the person. So my role when I joined MSF, I worked in the emergency response teams pretty much from day one. And I was sort of sent, the first time I was sent somewhere was to the Philippines, where there'd just been a typhoon, and I was given ultimate freedom. Essentially, it was a very small team, 4 people. I was the doctor in the team, and I was sort of told, well, you're an emergency doctor, go there and see how we can be useful, and if we can be useful, and then you sort of start from there. Now I'm in this role, though it's slightly different, because now I'm in charge of sort of raising the money and having more of a global oversight of the organization. And so it becomes a bit more difficult to balance, we should work there because there's needs there, but there's also needs here, and there's needs everywhere, and there are needs in the UK, so you have to have that perspective of, well, why should I particularly work here with and support these people, and why not elsewhere? But at some point you just have to be able to create a narrative, create an argument, and make a choice and say, well, actually, I really feel that these people today that I want to assist, I can be useful towards them, and two, I really think they're highly vulnerable. They really, really would benefit from my support, and therefore I can justify using resources here and not elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. So you talked about this unplanned sort of career journey. One question, I mean, I sort of feel like people who are drawn to the humanitarian space, there's a level of, for some, not all, adventure and this sort of travel potentially. What you were talking about? MSF being a thing in your mind from a young age. What was the appeal? What can you dive into? Like why was that an attractive proposition?
I mean, I think adventure is something in there, the going to places that many other people will never get to go to. I mean, I've been in, I'm not sure everyone will want to go to them, but I've been in places that many people would never get to see. I was in northern Syria in 2012, 2013. I've been in places where, you never get authorization to go there otherwise. And so I find that very interesting, the sort of the spirit of adventure and going to see things that other people just don't get to see. It's not just that though as well. I mean, I think we should own that as well. I think we should see that as a motivation for people. It's nothing to be ashamed of, the idea that you might want to go out and see something different and have an adventure. I also think there was something in there about kind of, there's a spirit of sans frontières, and we talk about the idea of, well, actually, I've left my home and my sort of comfort zone somehow because I want to go somewhere and experience something else, and I want to assist other people, and I don't want to be sort of prescribed to by the borders or whatever. I've come to assist you, even though I have nothing in common with you, So I've arrived in Pakistan not because I feel some kind of obligation to work in Pakistan or in Syria or in Yemen, but because people in Pakistan or Syria and Yemen need humanitarian assistance, and I've kind of decided that I'm interested in going somewhere else and supporting people elsewhere rather than supporting people, in my home community. Again, it's not a judgmental thing. That's not a better thing or a worse thing to do. One thing that didn't really kind of speak to me in the same way, but maybe non-medical people might be a bit different, is it's that cliche line of, I wanted to be a humanitarian because I wanted to help others, or I wanted to save lives. I mean, it's a little bit different for me because I was working in the National Health Service in the UK. So I was already helping others and saving lives, And there are some people still, when I speak to people, from my hometown, or sometimes people that put comments on my social media saying, well, there's people here who need support. And I completely agree. There are people here that need support. And there's no judgment about, people who don't choose to go and work for an international humanitarian organization who stay running the National Health Service, because I think that's also super important. I think it kind of takes all kinds, really. And we need to have people who do dedicate their lives to their local community, and we need to have people who are willing to go and work in other locations and work with other people and other societies as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, your background is you're a doctor, you're a surgeon. You've worked doing that both in the NHS, like you say, and also in various places internationally. However, now, as you say, you're the exec director. You're much more, fundraising in the UK, or being, how do you build up MSF through having an effective organisation? It's completely different, I guess. So talk to me about that transition, and what were the things that were most difficult from being like, I'm a doctor at heart to now I'm a leader of an organisation?
I mean, I think it is different and it isn't different as well. I was expecting, in some ways, it seems like less of a jump to be a doctor in the emergency department, A&E in the UK, and to then just go and do the same thing. You think, oh, I'm just practicing medicine elsewhere. And so that, in some ways, it seems similar. However, actually, by the time I'd finished my time in the National Health Service, I did plan to go back, but I was working in the emergency department as a sort of registrar in the emergency department. So I'd be the senior doctor on call or in the emergency department at night, essentially, or during the day. My job was to work as part of a team. It was always actually to be a manager. I was, even by the time I finished in the National Health Service, I was seeing some patients directly, but the majority of my time I was working with some of the more junior doctors, the nurses, the other health professionals, the system, I guess, because to keep that emergency department running, particularly in really busy times and during winter, you need to lead, essentially. You need to be that person who's making the decisions all the time without having the direct information that you might expect. You have a very sick patient comes into the resuscitation room, you might be taken up with them, and then you have to delegate the responsibility for everything else going on to somebody else. You have to know when to step back and when to step forward. So actually what I realized when I came into MSF was that was actually more the work I was doing from day one, I think. So from my entire time at MSF, whether it was in international work or now in the UK, has really been to lead a team. It's been less about me making all the decisions myself and more about kind of everybody understanding how this team functions, how we work together, what we're there to do, what objectives do we have, kind of building a team culture, I guess, together, so that when things get really bad, when things are very complicated, and that might be because you're in a war zone, or that might be because, something has happened in the UK that means that there's a risk around our fundraising, or, worst case scenario, one of our international staff members has a security incident and we're having to try and manage that. You know how your team are going to react because you know your team super well. You've worked together with them and you've all got the same shared understanding of what you're there to do. And I think that's actually, there's a huge amount of parallels between working as a doctor in a hospital context, where you're not working alone, you're always working as part of a team. And now this job here, where it's about building that kind of shared feeling of what are we there to do, that shared purpose, and being able to hold each other accountable to other roles.
Yeah. So a sort of universal question throughout the series, but I want to tweak it a little bit for you. What is good leadership? And also for you, how has your sort of emergency medicine background, how does that feed into your thinking around leadership? And just could you talk to me about what you think the characteristics are in great leaders?
I mean, I think great leaders know how to delegate. They know how to not just delegate, but almost let go sometimes. But they also have to know how to, when it is important to step in. I think that's something all the leaders I kind of respect, whether it's, unseen sort of leaders working in hospitals that I've worked in or in the humanitarian sector, or whether it's managers of football teams or whatever else. I think all the leaders are the people who will step up when it's necessary, but also know how to take that step back and sort of promote others. There's that kind of cliche of kind of, when there's a problem, you take all the responsibility, and when there's a success, you take none of the credit. And I do think that there's something in that, about really making sure that your team feel empowered to have the right to make mistakes, to understand the parameters within which they're working, but to know that sometimes something will happen and, they made a mistake, or, something unforeseen happened, and you will step in and take responsibility for that, as long as they worked within the parameters that you set for them. and they feel empowered to be able to make decisions and to be a bit bold and to take a few risks from time to time. I do think also the flip side of that is also saying, well, there's some things that are just unacceptable, and that's the same thing as in emergency medicine as in, you know, in my current role or in any organization. I think is to sort of say, well, actually, there's a red line though here. You can't take risks with certain things. You know, I think medical training is very good for that, because you do teach people, okay, the very basics, the very essentials of, if you always go back to your essentials and you know, have the emergency response kind of essentials in place, then you'll be fine. And knowing when you've got time to think about something and reflect on something, and knowing when you just have to kind of go back to the basics and the kind of crisis response mode is quite important. And I don't know if I always get it right, but I think it's really about deferring to people being able to make decisions within their scope of decision-making power. We call it subsidiarity in MSF.
Mm-hmm. Something I'm curious about, sort of leading on to that, is my experience with people who have sort of a medical background who have then been in sort of non-medical leadership roles. I don't know if this is just a very small sample size, but their ability to sort of lean into difficult conversations feels better than a lot of other people. I'm curious about what your thoughts are on being able to have difficult conversations in the setting you're in your role now, and how medicine has fed into that.
I think it probably has a bit. I hadn't really thought about it before, but it is something you're trained to do when you go to medical school. You're trained to have the difficult conversations. And, you know, when you're faced with that scenario where you're having to tell somebody that their relative, their loved one has died, or is critically unwell, or has a terminal illness, then you kind of deal with anything. You know, their life is completely turned upside down, and you're having a really difficult conversation, or the other way around, where actually you're having to sort of say, well, actually, we can't treat you, or you have to behave in a certain way. You know, working in the emergency department at sort of 2:00 in the morning on a you know, Saturday morning or Sunday morning, you're dealing with people who are extremely violent, extremely, you know, unreasonable, who are unable to really engage with, and you have to know when to stop having the conversation as well, and to say, well, this is not a constructive conversation to be having. And I think so you do get trained to deal with that, and I do think we should do more training for that. I do think when I look at some of my colleagues that I meet in the sector, maybe it's something about the humanitarian and charity sector, this idea of everyone's motivation is because they're good people who want to help people. And that's kind of true. You don't go and work in the humanitarian or charity sector if you don't want to help people. It's definitely not for the salaries, or as far as I can tell. But we make assumptions that just because you're underneath that core a good person, that somehow you're instinctively going to be able to have these difficult conversations, be able to kind of engage with that. And you have to be trained to do that. It's not enough to just be a good person, to be well-meaning.
Yeah.
You have to go through the training, I guess, and the scenarios, and almost because you don't want to let loose a bunch of medical students onto the wards to have difficult conversations with people. We do so much of scenario planning, of doing this with actors, we're doing this with each other, so that by the time you actually do it in real life, you have those skills, you have those skills, you've faced every different type of difficult conversation. And I think there's something to be said in our sector for maybe putting people through that a bit more. You feel a bit stupid talking to an actor and pretending that they have a terminal disease, or the same thing, you know, the first time you have to make someone redundant, or you have to, you know, fire someone, which, you know, happens even in our sector. You have to know how to do that in a way that you know, respects their dignity as well as you know, getting the message across.
Yeah. So this is potentially an impossible question, but if you were to, for sort of viewers who are interested in developing this ability to have difficult conversations, maybe they feel like they're not there, what's a quick lesson from you around how to approach that kind of thinking?
I mean, I think it's really important to see the other person as a person. to understand where they're coming from. It doesn't change the message you're trying to pass, but I think always think of them as another person, and yeah, talk to them as another person. Don't talk down to them. Don't talk up to them. Just be very clear and make sure that you're not being misunderstood, I guess. And then, it sounds stupid, but one technique you can do is just practice in the mirror, because I'm probably doing it now because I'm not really looking at myself, but often you might be saying one thing, but your body language or your face or something says something different. And so, everyone in the entire world is going to have difficult conversations. It's not just when you're when you're the leader of a humanitarian organization or charity. It's not just when you're a medical doctor. Everybody will have to have a difficult conversation, whether it's just dumping someone or telling your child that their pet has died. It's worth kind of getting to the point where understanding how you're seen by the other person and put yourself in their shoes, I guess.
Yeah, that's really useful. MSF have, I think, a lot of organisations talk about being bold. MSF are bold. How do you keep the boldness?
Yeah, I mean, it can be a bit of a cliche at times that you say bold. Some other organisations call us cowboys. I think it's important to keep bold in terms of what we say and the positions we take. Mm-hmm. At the same time, making sure we're not seen as sort of, too risky, I guess, in some things. There's some things where you shouldn't be bold about. So security management being one of them. But being bold in terms of, we have a concept called témoignage in our way of working, which is about speaking out, essentially, and bearing witness. And that's the sort of strength behind our boldness of always discussing, when do we need to speak about something? When do we actually say, well, no, we don't want to stay silent on this. We need to speak about it.
Yeah.
And the way we maintain that, I think, is really by our culture. We have a culture of debate and discussion. So the role I worked in just before I came here was our reflection unit. And the reflection unit looks at not just what we did, but what we said about what we did, the positions we took, and how we discussed them, how we made those choices. And I think that reflections is sort of super important. Every individual in MSF is kind of encouraged to reflect and to discuss and to debate and to kind of really think through the choices that we make. And everybody, because we're an associative movement, so we're an association, every member of the association has the right to engage in a discussion and debate. It can be a bit unmanageable at times because we're an awful lot of people today and everybody wants to have a say. But in the end, it's helpful to have everybody having those conversations about, the recent one was about Gaza and at what point is this classified to be a genocide? And there were, a lot of opinions in there, and there were a lot of risks, felt to be risks around if we called it a genocide. What would be the risk to our Palestinian staff for a start, and to our patients? What would be the risk to our operations? But what would be the benefits of that as well? Is it just about making ourselves feel better? Is there an added value? And as you can imagine, I mean, those debates and discussions, they went on and on and on and on for many, many months. Yeah. And people in positions like mine that are tasked with listening to that discussion and that debate, taking people's ideas on board, and then eventually somebody has to make a choice, and you have to own that choice. So I worked with people. So I worked with the other members of the reflection unit I was in had been senior leaders in MSF before me. So one of them was Roni Brauman, who was, an early president of MSF, has held very high position in MSF, and who made some of the biggest statements that MSF has ever made. So, he talked out about the situation in Ethiopia during Band-Aid, sort of saying, well, this isn't a natural crisis, this is forced displacement. He made various decisions and took various positions, and some of which were very unpopular. And some of them were very successful. And sometimes he sort of says, I speak to him and he say, yeah, I said this at that time. And in retrospect, it was a mistake. Mm-hmm. I still own it. I don't deny I said it. I made that choice based on the information I had at hand. And either, I shouldn't have said it, or I still own what I said because that was the best information I had at the time. And I think our boldness is really about that, about that feeling of everybody can be involved in the conversation, but somebody has to make the choice and then own the choice that they made.
Yeah. I mean, you've preempted something I wanted to talk about specifically on the report. It was December, wasn't it? The report was released.
Yes,
on Gaza. So in the report it says, what our medical teams have witnessed on the ground throughout this conflict is consistent with the descriptions provided by an increasing number of legal experts and organisations, concluding that genocide is taking place in Gaza. Well, I've got sort of three questions around this. The first one is about staff well-being, and MSF, whether Gaza or other places that you work, MSF staff are going to bear witness to atrocities of various kinds. How is MSF, and I guess MSF UK is somewhat detached from this in ways that MSF, I don't know what you call it, but MSF sort of central.
Yeah. Well, we don't. But yeah, it's a complicated one. But yeah, operational centres.
So the operational centre, like how is MSF supporting its staff or associates or partners who are witnessing these atrocities?
I mean, we are to some extent at some distance, but we do recruit and deploy international mobile staff. So we have quite a lot of MSF UK contracted staff who are working or have been working in Gaza, and we do have a duty of care towards them. So we have people who myself, I was contracted to MSF UK, and I worked in Aleppo, I worked in Yemen, I worked in Central African Republic, and my contracting office was MSF UK, and so we do have a duty to help people process and come to terms with what they're seeing at the time, and of course, when they are, there's support for them on the ground there, but at the same time when they come back, and I think that's something that traditionally, I think all humanitarian organizations have been not very good at, that we're all learning to get better at that, is providing the support to people so that they maybe when they first get back home, they don't want to talk about it, but maybe in 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, they might start going, hold on, I need to process some of the stuff I saw there. And I'm not saying we're good at that, but at least we have acknowledged that it's something that is important. So we call it a sort of psychosocial unit that maintains contact with everybody who's ever worked for sort of MSF and make sure that the door is open. What we try not to do is force people. At times when I started with MSF, they said, "Oh, you're going to a really complex environment. You're going to see atrocities and you're going to see horrible things. So we're going to brief you about that so that you're aware of that. Of course, you're aware of that. You're going there." And then we're going to force debrief you when you come back. So you're supposed to offload all of that. And I think more and more increasingly we realise that's quite harmful. Mm-hmm. But that's for the internationally mobile staff. But at the same time, Gaza in particular, I mean, all contexts affect people who are having to deal with the thought of them. But Gaza has been extremely traumatic for a lot of people, partly because it was so polarising as well. And there's a risk of vicarious trauma, I think, even in the UK. You might have someone who you think, well, their job is just to work in finance or fundraising, but our fundraising colleagues or communications colleagues are hearing the most horrific stories. They're taking that information and sharing that information and communicating about it. And they hear sometimes the worst stories. Our human resource teams who are having to listen to people when they've come back from places, that there is a sort of secondhand trauma there. And you also have to make sure that people know how to access the support for that, partly because actually, they can sometimes feel almost guilty that they feel upset by this because they're not there. Why should I feel bad about this? But you have to let people acknowledge that they're upset and they're distressed and that they have as much right as anybody else to access support for that and to really, be able to be distressed and be unhappy and be upset. And it's horrific. It's a horrific field to work in many ways. So it's making sure that everyone knows how to access support and also recognizing that some people will need more support than others. And it's not a sign of weakness if you do need support. And some people, the other way around, might just feel that they'd rather not talk about it. And that's fine as well.
I think I mean, yeah, I think that there's a clarity in what you've said. I can see your medical thinking coming into this. I think it's really interesting. The vicarious kind of trauma is I saw a news article recently about moderators of social platforms who had major PTSD. So can you just talk a little bit about your UK staff who haven't been deployed or anything? Like what are the actual, is there a sort of helpline? What are the mechanisms that you support in terms of vicariously as well?
Yeah, I mean, essentially we have a sort of, as part of our employee benefits package, we have a sort of a helpline that people can contact at any time. We also have a sort of system of sort of, mental health first aid, as we call it in the UK office, whose job is just to kind of be there and to be a sort of like a listening board. They're not supposed to act, they're not, but they help give people coping mechanisms, make suggestions. Because I think when you're in that situation where you're feeling very traumatized by something, you often don't even recognize it. And you don't recognize that maybe you're being a bit aggressive or a bit brusque or a bit emotional. And the job of the mental health first aid is sometimes just to pick up on someone and say, are you feeling okay? And, so in all our teams, there are mental health first aiders. Everybody knows who they are. And they're kind of empowered as well at times to go up to someone and go, are you okay? Their job is not necessarily to act, they're not there to replace the management line. Their job is to check in and maybe give people a few tips about, well, maybe you need to take an afternoon off, or maybe you should give, we have some counsellors that are on our staff as well, or maybe you need to phone the hotline, or maybe you just need to have a bit of a walk, and a breath of fresh air, or helping people to look after themselves, really. I think it's been a really helpful sort of mechanism, I think, because it's not just about people knowing where to access support. It's almost people being prompted to access support, because I think that is often the big problem, is people kind of going, well, I shouldn't be the person, there's bigger problems out there, so I shouldn't be the person who's seeking the support. And it's not just it affects their well-being, it affects their performance. And it sounds a little bit cynical, but essentially someone who's really unhappy and very distressed, they're not going to be able to work properly. And we need to fix that as well.
Yeah, great. You touched on it earlier around when to speak out and when not to speak out. With the report in December, my question is sort of based on that. How you have slightly touched on it, but I'm wondering if we can delve into the thinking a little bit more on when does MSF decide when and how to speak out, knowing that things like access and like there's a level of, you need to have not annoyed the wrong people to be able to do your job. So what's your thinking on that, and that seesaw balance of like what we should say and how versus the impact and the damage that it might have on us being able to programmatically deliver?
Yeah, it's a constant balance. It's exactly that. And if the risks of speaking out outweigh the benefits of speaking out, and you're just doing it to make yourself feel better, then that's the wrong reason to speak out, essentially. There's some people, including colleagues in MSF, who feel that we're obliged to always speak out. So they interpret this concept of témoignage as we're obliged to speak. And, there's almost a sort of founding myth of MSF, because it was a group of doctors who were working for the Red Cross who apparently, the founding myth is that they wanted to speak out about the situation in Biafra and in Nigeria, and the Red Cross don't speak because they have their specific mandate. And so they founded MSF because they wanted to speak out. It's not quite true. It is a bit of a myth, but some people have taken that on this, we are obliged to always speak out. And that's not true. It's an active choice when we speak and when we don't speak. And we do have to spend a bit of time going through the risks and trying to think through the different risks. But the primary risk, of course, the one we have to take most seriously is the security of our patients and of our staff. And, there are times when we have decided not to say anything because we just knew that, that would, the risk to our staff would be much higher, or to our patients would be much higher. So the Gaza report, one of the conversation we've been having for many, many months, including with our Palestinian colleagues, was what if we do say it's a genocide or we support, the other comment was we're not legitimate to call it a genocide. We're not a human rights or a legal organization. However, we're one of the few organizations who are direct witnesses to what's happening on the ground. So almost we have that information. So we had long conversations, including with our Palestinian colleagues, about if we were to say this, what would be the risk? If we were to say this, do you think that there would be a sort of punishment on you? Mm. Sometimes we are in situations where we do believe that our staff are targeted because the organization is targeted. The conclusion we came to with the Gaza report was, all our staff were at risk, all our patients, were at risk, and actually us calling it a genocide wasn't going to increase that level of risk. There was quite some discussion about, well, is that going to increase the likelihood that we're not allowed to have international staff in Gaza anymore? So the majority of our staff in Gaza are Palestinian, but we have been keeping a relatively small number because of the security management and the difficulties, but about 30 or 40 international staff. And we did look through what would be the likelihood that Israel would no longer grant us access into Gaza, the very little access we had anyway, and what situation would that leave our Palestinian staff in, And there were some concerns from the Palestinian staff of, well, we do feel slightly more protected by having international staff around. Mm-hmm. Actually, that's not true necessarily. It's not borne out by the data that we have. It's that, we had Palestinian staff killed. We didn't see any sign that they were protected because there were international staff in the vicinity. But, there was a discussion about, well, how realistic is that we might not be able to get international staff in and what would happen. So we constantly have to think through the potential consequences, which means that sometimes, the conversation around Gaza in particular has been months, until we released that report, it'd been months of discussion, months of debate. And for some of my colleagues, that was incredibly frustrating. There were people who sort of said, this is a genocide on day one. People who wanted to talk about the history of Palestinian kind of situation, the situation for Palestinians since 1948 or whatever, and who wanted us to speak out about that. And they were extremely frustrated about what they saw as us being very slow to come to the conclusion that we supported the diagnosis of genocide, I guess. And so there's no way of getting the balance right, I think. Yeah. I do believe that maybe we could have been a little bit quicker with Gaza, because from May, June last year, we were seeing the situation at the Rafah crossing of all the conditions of genocide were sort of being met, but we had to take a bit more time. And it was very important to us that legitimate organizations were also saying it, because alone, what's the point in MSF calling it a genocide? It doesn't change anything. If we can support other organizations like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and others, then we're essentially supporting and adding our voice to something and hopefully having some form of impact.
Yeah, this is sort of feeds into the next question I have on it. I suppose there's a couple of things. One is, it takes somebody to be willing to put the first domino down, because there will be several organisations that we will do it when others do it. So I'm curious about your thinking on first mover, sort of the first movers in that. And also I'm really curious about you said Human Rights Watch, you said Amnesty. You're obviously looking around at who is saying what. How has it felt? So you released, we're in end of Jan now.
Yeah.
So it's been out for 6 weeks or so, the report. What are your feelings on observing the rest of sort of UK humanitarian-based organisations and the lack of willingness to speak out in this way? So there's two questions there. One is first mover, and the other is landscape of UK humanitarian organisations.
I think we're often MSF. This was not the best example, but I still think we maybe in some ways were the first mover. in that we were one of the few organizations that were already working in Gaza and remained working in Gaza, throughout. So I think even though we didn't use the word genocide, we were very quickly talking about saying what we see. So the concept of témoignage is just saying what we see. And so I remember doing interviews on the BBC within the first sort of week, and it was seen as, I met some of my peers in other organizations saying, oh, you guys have been a bit bold because, in that first week I was being questioned, well, aren't Hamas using their ambulances? Aren't Hamas hiding in the hospitals? And having to kind of say, no, but already we are seeing our colleagues, being threatened. We are seeing patients with massive injuries. We are seeing, civilians being killed. And I think we were trying to be very strong throughout. So even if we aren't going to label this as a genocide or not, we're going to make sure that the real picture of actually what is happening is out there. And particularly in a context like Gaza, and it was the same when I worked in northern Yemen, there were no international journalists. When I worked in northern Yemen, there were no journalists, as far as I can tell. I never met a single journalist. It was almost like the responsibility to speak and to say, we call it telling it how it is, to just talk about what we're seeing. I think we're often the first mover in that because maybe it's something to do with our sort of, our independence of funding. We're a private medical organization, so we don't have major institutional donors. We're not politically tied like that, which means that we at least don't have to face the political consequences of if I speak about the Saudis bombing northern Yemen, or I speak about, the massive destruction of Gaza, I'm not going to lose, I'm not facing the risks that one government or another will decide to stop funding my organization. Individual private donors might. But if you stick always to that concept of, I'm just telling you what I'm seeing, telling you what our teams are seeing, I think that's really important. So I think in terms of us doing that, we just carried on doing what we always do. There are times where there are some exceptional places where we just wouldn't even talk about what we're seeing at all, because we just know that the way that would be interpreted would put people at risk. But it's quite rare. There's only a few places I can think of where we literally don't even mention we're working there. And a lot of places it's more about, well, we're very happy to talk about what we're seeing, and it's actually trying to get traction of people listening to us, getting. We should be so lucky as to have the number of interviews about Gaza that we were requested for Sudan, for example, or never mind Myanmar or the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I think that being that first mover in terms of talking about our work, we're often there, and I think we're very comfortable with that one. We maybe, in terms of labeling it as something, we're maybe not always the first mover, and that might be something that's more relevant for Amnesty or Human Rights Watch because it's more within their wheelhouse. In terms of the other organizations, I do think that maybe there is some scope for some of the other organizations to also talk about what they're doing and what they're seeing. I think sometimes, I go to meetings and people go, "Oh, we're so glad you could say it because we never could say that." And what I don't know, because I've not worked for the other organizations, is to delve into why couldn't you say that? What would be the risk to you of saying that, and not judging them for not talking about what they're seeing or what their teams are seeing, but trying to understand why they wouldn't necessarily talk about a situation in the most basic terms of, this is the situation that we're seeing today, and these are the facts of the case. As long as you stick to data and facts, then for me the risks seem relatively low. And I don't know how much of that is maybe about fundraising and how you feel it might be perceived. Coming on to the fundraising, I have faced a time here in MSF UK back in 2016. I worked for a short period of time while I was doing my master's on the issue of refugees and migrations. It was during the refugee crisis in Europe, and one of the fears, I guess, from some of my fundraising colleagues was, well, people don't like refugees and they don't think they should come over here. So if we talk about it, people might not give us money, and that's their job. My fundraising colleagues is to kind of, to raise a note of caution of, let's not talk about the refugee crisis, or let's not talk about Libya and the detention camps, or let's not talk about the situation in Gaza, because we think that's what donors don't want to hear. But on the flip side, I feel that, we should give people who donate money more credit, actually. I've always found whenever I speak to donors, even if they don't agree with what we're doing, they understand what we're doing, and it's their choice whether they want to give us money or not. But we shouldn't hide what we're doing and what we're seeing because we're afraid that people don't want to give us money.
Yeah, great. Getting close to the sort of wrap up, rapid questions. Before we get there, though, curious about, so going back to emergency medicine and your experience in times of, I imagine, incredible stress, almost like the most unimaginable stress for you personally. What advice from that do you have for people who are facing an incredibly stressful time in their own lives? Like, how do you manage stress?
I think it's about coming back a little bit to the sort of concept of stoicism almost, and what can you really control in this situation? I mean, in some ways, when you're a humanitarian practitioner, or when you're, a leader, or when you're an emergency medic, you have all the power actually in that situation. And it's very stressful because you also have all the responsibility. You're having to make choices and decisions that really affect someone's lives, but you're almost in a position of privilege, and you can control your actions, and you can take some time to reflect on that. But you also have, everyone's human, so you might end up making the wrong choice or the wrong decision, but you can only make the best choice and the best decision you have based on the information you have. So I think in terms of handling the stress of the consequences, it's about making sure that you're really checking in on yourself and checking, well, what's leading me to make the decisions I'm making and the choices I'm making? Because I have, in many ways, the power and the control over this situation. When you look at it from the flip side, as a doctor, our patients, or as a humanitarian, the people we're aiming to assist, they have very little power in that dynamic. And so, it should be much more stressful, I guess, for them, because they have no control over the situation. The only thing you can do is control what you can control. And it's just about kind of, I guess, handling the stress, kind of saying, well, I feel confident that I made what I felt was the best possible choice in that scenario at that time. And okay, maybe the outcome wasn't what I wanted it to be, but I was trying to do my best. It sounds a little bit cheesy, but my motivation was always to try and do the best I wanted to do for the person in front of me. So all you can do is do that. And then I do think it's very important as well to not let it consume you. Emergency medicine, humanitarianism, running a big organization, it can be all consuming. It can be very serious work, I guess. And I had a colleague when I worked in Paris who would say, we're non-serious people doing serious work. You need to let that non-serious side out, including at work sometimes. You can't be too serious all the time, and take a bit of time out to have some fun, and that's time out of work, but that's also, in work, take some time out for a little bit of light relief, even when you're dealing with really horrible situations.
Yeah. What's your sort of channels of venting and finding that fun and making sure that you're not all consumed all of the time? What do you do?
Well, one of the big reasons I moved back to the UK, apart from this job being very interesting, was that I am from here, and so I could go back and watch my football team play, and which I couldn't really do when I was working overseas, and even when I was living in Paris. You can't commute from Paris back to Wrexham to watch the football.
I've watched the documentary series though.
Yeah, we were a bit worried that make us all look very stupid, but actually it's not too bad. It's okay. I don't know how much mileage you've got in watching people from Wrexham watch a not very good football club, but there you go. And then, I've always been very much into music, live music festivals, going to events. And it was one of my stipulations when I did start with MSF was I always have to be able to go to Glastonbury. I haven't been to Glastonbury for a while. I go to Green Man these days, but being able to go to those events and sort of let off a bit of steam. And what's interesting now is MSF UK, we're quite involved in live music, and we send teams to the music festivals. And so I have a sort of list of festivals where our face-to-face team can go, and where I will go with them, and others where I'm like, please don't go to that one, that's my festival. You know, they're the small ones, it's fine. And but being able to combine that's been amazing. And this year we've done an awful lot of, well, last year, you know, we did an awful lot of work with Massive Attack, and that's been like a dream for me, because it's like combining, you know, the thing I do for fun and to one of my favorite bands with work. And I think letting those sides bleed in together, it can happen. You can make work fun at times as well.
That's amazing. I love that. If you could zoom forward 10 years and look back on your sort of tenure at MSF, what impact would you like to have seen it had looking back?
I mean, I think really I've tried to make sure that everybody who works in MSF UK, and as we mentioned earlier, you know, we're not directly on the front lines. We have we contract some of our colleagues to go and work on the front lines, and that can mean that, you know, when you're sitting in London, because you don't see the day to day, you can feel that your job is not necessarily as important. You know, you can end up with this sort of 2-tier hierarchy. I think all international organizations have that sort of, the hero doctors working on the front lines, and then the poor guy who's working in IT or finance admin or fundraising feels that they're kind of, they're lower down somehow in the hierarchy. And I think what's really important for this type of organization, for MSF as a movement, as a global organization, is that everybody sees the importance of their role. This can't work unless they exist, essentially. And so I really feel that in 10 years' time, and I'm working on it already, if everybody sees the value of their work and how their work contributes to that sort of that bigger picture, and so they can kind of say, well, I was a very small part of that, you know. And I think if we get to 10 years' time and people feel happy that they work for MSF and that they see the value of their work, even if they're volunteering on reception or something else, then I think that will be my job will be done.
Fantastic. So the last sort of 2 rapid questions. You're building a Natalie charity. It's for sort of, it's your own. You're building a personal board of trustees to steer your life forward. Who are you putting on the board, and why?
It's an interesting one. MSF, our board is elected by the association, so I don't get any. We don't have people standing for it. But I think I would really want a combination of the people, the people that we aim to assist somehow, you know, by the charity, whatever the charity's aims are, somehow being involved in the governance, in the board of trustees. So, you know, I do like the idea of having people who've got experience of the particular issue themselves being part of governing the issues and sort of really inputting into that. And then I think you need to have people who are willing to challenge. I always appreciate when I have trustees who are willing to challenge me a little bit, who are willing to kind of, you know, push back a little bit on what I'm saying. Well, together it's about having a discussion and a debate. So it's not about them kind of, you know, wielding their power, but coming at this collectively and challenging a little bit of who I want. And then I'd also want Gary Lineker, because I think he says some really interesting things. So I think he needs to be on my board of trustees somewhere.
Amazing. A phone company that comes to you and says, Natalie, we're going to enable you to send a text message to every humanitarian worker out there. You've got the confines of a text message, small character limit. What are you saying to those people working in conflict and crisis?
Oh God, that's a really difficult one. I work with a colleague whose mantra was always, just keep going. You know, whatever problem you came to her with, she would say, just keep going. So I think it probably would just be that. It would be just keep going. You know, I think the majority of people are trying to do the right thing and really just need a feeling of they've got backup. And I think my job would be, got your back, you know, just keep going.
I love that. That's it. Thank you so much for this conversation. Really, really insightful, really good.
I could talk along for hours and hours. Yeah.
Is there anything before we sort of, before we finish, anything that's on your mind? I just like to offer people a space of, like, if there's anything that is on your mind that you want to say to sort of charity professionals, that we haven't spoken about?
Not really. I think I just hope it comes out that there's not really a right way and a wrong way of doing this. I think we do need to make sure that, not just in the charity sector, in all sectors, that we don't erase the individual personalities. I think so much of there's no kind of corporate guideline of how to do this and how not to do this. And I think, bring your personality to the table is really important, And if that personality happens to fit the job, then that's great. And if it doesn't, then it's probably not the right job for you. So it's fine.